fight, never quit, do it right, play the game, win it life, have no shame, there's no time, pick a lane, commit and climb, the only way to win it life. I never miss, that's fact, taking big swings, bitch, hand me the bat, put me in the ring, you'll go out in a bag, cause I sing what I mean and I bring it to the mad light. Ain't got time to kill, I got time to feel, I took the red pill, I know life's short so I wanna live real, but how's it supposed to feel?
Welcome friends, in this episode I'm conducting maintenance on the front axle of the Jeep. When I first went to go see the Jeep, the previous owner told me she needs some CV joints, and the telltale clicking was definitely there on the drive home. So I ordered several parts for the front axle right away, and I waited for everything to trickle in. But while doing some cursory research, I found that the front sway bar changed about halfway through 2003. The older sway bars were larger, but they're hollow, and then the newer ones were thinner, but they were solid, which made it more beneficial for handling. It was too easy for me to run to the junkyard and pull a new sway bar, complete with the bushings and brackets, off of a 2004 Overland WJ, and replace the old version on this Jeep. This was one of the first things that I installed on the Jeep, but I figured I wouldn't have to take it off again when I got around to servicing the front axle. I didn't have the front bumper on, and this vehicle did not come with a factory front skid plate, so I only had to remove the front bumper support bracket using a 10mm socket to freely access the sway bar bracket bolts. I made sure that the vehicle was flat on the ground because lifting either side would mean putting pressure on the other side of the sway bar. Then I removed the sway bar end links using a 15mm socket and an 18mm wrench. Finally, I removed the bracket bolts using a 18mm socket and a long extension with my impact gun. The sway bars look nearly identical, and you need some calipers to tell the difference in diameter since they are not labeled with part numbers. But I did find that the bushings were labeled. The older sway bar bushings will have the Alpha Charlie imprint, and the new ones are Alpha Echo. While doing this swap, I did change out the end links also since they were definitely shot. Picking up from the last episode, I needed to get the Jeep out of the garage and get the old rims to the junkyard to collect the core charge. So I quickly threw on the spacers and new rims and tires. I needed to get the Jeep out of the garage because the passenger side axle would be too long to remove indoors. It is painfully obvious in this video that the Jeep is the first solid front axle vehicle that I have worked on. My plan was to do one side at a time so that the neighbors wouldn't call in a derelict vehicle and have the Jeep towed. But I didn't realize that this is extremely challenging just lifting one side since the whole vehicle would shift, and it was super sketchy. Later, I end up using center lift points like the center of the front axle, the transmission support, and the bell housing, though that last one might be bad. Anyway, I played with it for a really long time until I felt like it was safe enough to work underneath it, and I started by pulling off the caliper and rotor. I clamped the brake line near the lower control arm and removed the 11mm banjo bolt from the caliper, allowing the fluid to drain into a pan. The guide pin bolts that hold the caliper proper onto the bracket are 17mm, and mine were seized on pretty tight, so I had to use a breaker bar to loosen and remove them. Then I could remove the bracket bolts with an 18mm socket. Next up was removing the wheel hub and bearing along with the axle. I had just watched Nadger Off-Road do this, and I thought that this was a fantastic idea since I was replacing the bearing and the axle at the same time, so there was no need to separate them. The 3 hub bolts are removed with a 13mm 12-point socket. Then the whole thing came off with the help of a hammer. I was certain that the ball joints needed to be replaced, so I also had to get the steering knuckle off. After a struggle, I removed the cotter pin from the upper ball joint and the lower ball joint, and then I realized that the lower ball joint nut was a special size that I did not have. I loosened the upper castellated nut and removed the tie rod cotter pin encapsulated nut before hammering out the tie rod and then I raced off to O'Reilly's to find a 1 1/8 inch socket. Once I had the right tool for the job, I loosened the lower ball joint castellated nut and hammered the steering knuckle off of the ball joints. You'll see me using this claw hammer because I didn't want to buy a sledge since I have one back home, but I ended up having to buy one later anyway. After removing the knuckle, I went to remove the ball joints using the ball joint press that I rented from O'Reilly's when I realized that it wasn't going to work. I tried for an hour before giving up because Google said that I needed a special Chrysler adapter. I didn't think I could find the adapter locally, so I ordered the Chrysler ball joint adapter on eBay and got back to work on the front axle suspension. I unbolted the sway bar end link with a 15mm socket and 18mm wrench, which caused the Jeep to shift a bit as the axle articulated. And then I removed the 13mm nuts from the lower shock mount and the Jeep shifted again. So I readjusted everything until I felt safe again. I could have fixed this whole problem by just lifting both sides and supporting them with jack stands. But with everything but the control arms disconnected, I could pull the spring out and remove the 13mm nut from the upper shock mount and pull out the shock. I wanted to get painting on the axle as soon as possible, so I decided to clean up the spring bucket area, which was covered in rust. That is when I saw how bad the damage was. The whole thing was thin and brittle, easily falling apart. So I pumped the brakes and did some research. The majority of the Jeep was rust-free, so this was odd from my perspective, but apparently it's just a design flaw, because the spring isolators don't allow water to drain, so the bucket cap just sits in water constantly. I found a few Welding kits and one bolt-on kit from Dorman. I didn't have a welder, but weld-on seemed like the safest bet since I was concerned about the bolt-on, that things wouldn't line up properly, or if I had to replace something, there would be a shift in the suspension and it wouldn't line back up, and then I'd have to take the whole thing apart. So I ended up finding a YouTube video where a guy bought the bolt-on kit and welded it in to ensure that it wouldn't shift and to help reinforce the other brackets. My overhead would skyrocket with this decision, but there were other parts of this project which also required a welder. And Harbor Freight had just extended a sale on their welders, so I jumped on it and bought the Titanium 200 Unlimited Multi-Process Welder. I never did auto body in high school, but I've been wanting to learn how to weld for the past 12 years or so. I kept mentioning this to my wife, who pointed me to a local college in Washington, which gave cheap classes and had a workshop where you could rent time on a welder. I took one class, and they taught us how to set up an ESAB Rebel for MIG, and then had us weld a few coupons before declaring that we could weld, and saying that the advanced class with an actual pro cost 5 times as much. The shop time was something like $80 an hour plus materials, so I never ended up going back. But asking around since then, everyone just kind of tells me that unless you want to take a full-time apprenticeship, you need to just buy a welder and learn through experience. All the welds that you see in this series are awful. Hopefully I get better when fabbing for the Raptor. Back on the Jeep, I still needed to pull the front axle to start the repair. I absolutely did not want to do this because I'd opened myself up to the possibility of having the Jeep reported as derelict and towed while I was at work. But there was nothing that I could really do, so I put a cover on the Jeep and I tried to work as fast as I could to get the front axle done. I started by trying to remove the steering arm from the pitman arm, but I didn't have any luck actually getting it off, so I left it attached and disconnected the track bar with a 15mm wrench and 18mm socket. Then I moved on to removing the upper control arm bolts with a 14mm deep socket, and I believe it was an 18mm wrench for the nut. The lower control arms are a 21mm wrench and socket, and then I also disconnected the Driveshaft from the Pinion using an 8mm socket to pull off the strap bolts. The last thing was the diff breather, which I had actually already undone. It was clipped to the upper shock mount. After that, I rolled the axle out on a Harbor Freight furniture dolly. I had a city code enforcer come visit me a few days before due to a noise complaint, so I had to wait until my next door neighbors left the house and I closed the garage door, threw on some Ear Pro, Eye Pro, and a respirator, and started cutting off the old rusted buckets. It was pretty easy to cut through, but the angle in the adjacent metal made it a little difficult of an angle for cutting. I would still need to grind down the lip completely flush to ensure everything would fit properly. After grinding down the old inner bucket, I used a wire wheel to remove all the rust and then beveled the underside of the new spring bucket to give my weld a place to sit. I wanted to ensure that the inside of the bucket and all of the surfaces were sealed, so I ordered weld-through primer, which was delayed on Amazon, but I ended up finding it locally at Northern Tool. I had an extra consideration since I was also installing Iron Rock's bar pin eliminator kit on the front axle. The extra metal from the new bucket made it so that they wouldn't fit right, so I had to cut and grind the new lower shock mount brackets as well as drill out the OEM and new buckets to allow everything to fit properly. Then I could bolt everything together in preparation for tack welds. Once I got what I thought were some good tack welds on the bucket, I removed the hardware and I started the finish weld. I didn't do myself any favors during the welding. I didn't have a great ground. I didn't grind the paint back the standard 2-inch minimum, and I didn't practice beforehand. And I was welding the flux core, which is ironically challenging compared to the standard MIG. This made for some ugly welds and lots of undercut and some poor penetration in some areas. But luckily the thicker material was easier to manage than body sheet metal, and in reality, these welds aren't structural. Next, I got to work on the driver's side using the experience from the passenger side and all the YouTube welding advice that I could ingest over a couple of days. But the result was similar. So when I was finished, I tried to hide as much ugly as possible with a flap disc before prepping the surface and coating with self-etching primer and chassis paint. From this point, I was hoping that everything would be downhill, but I found that actually from this point forward, everything would just be knocking heavy chips in my resilience. I removed the driver's side axle much like I did with the passenger side while throwing those extra coats of paint onto the new buckets. I found that having the axle out made everything very easy to access, but often it was harder to work on since it wasn't clamped down. Once I got the driver's side knuckle removed, I could start to work on replacing the upper control arm bushings and the ball joints. I removed the upper control arms with a T40 Torx bit and a 15mm socket. The lower control arms are similar to the rear, and I used a 21mm socket and wrench to remove them. Next, I pulled off the track bar and noted that both bushings on the track bar were completely shredded. Then I used a 15mm socket and 18mm wrench to remove the steering stabilizer before moving on to the differential. I removed the diff cover using a 13mm socket and drained the fluid before cleaning the mating surface and then going on to the pinion seal, which I did much like the rear axle, but with a few changes. The pinion nut is the same size as the lower ball joint nut, so I used that new socket to pull it off. I tried multiple new ways to remove this seal, including from the inside like a traditional seal puller, but it just ended up ripping the sheet metal. So I had to go from the outside again to actually get it out. I had the wrong type of new pinion seal, so I moved on to the ball joints. I was able to get the upper ball joint out with little difficulty using parts that I ordered on Amazon. It turned out, however, that I didn't even need to order those because AutoZone actually rents out those special Chrysler adapters. When I got to the lower ball joint, it wouldn't budge at all, and I was only 50% certain that the rental tool wouldn't have a catastrophic failure and just send shrapnel through my legs and face. So I decided to move on to the upper control arm bushings. After giving up briefly and considering buying an air hammer and compressor and tank, I was able to find a combination of adapters to get the bushing to press right out. The passenger side upper control arm bushing is installed in essentially two pieces of sheet metal. I thought that there was a sleeve, but there isn't one at all, so you have to put a socket between the metal to prevent it from collapsing while removing and installing the bushing. I really wanted to grab some plate, cut it to size, and weld it in there, but I wasn't sure if there was a reason that it was built this way, so I just left it be. The lower ball joints did eventually come out, but required an odd setup of adapters to make it work, along with nerves of steel and an impact gun. Next, I cleaned out the rust from the inside surface before installing the new ball joints using the special Chrysler adapters. I will say that the replacement ball joints I purchased were sealed and they were not serviceable, so that made things a lot easier. I had to get creative with the upper control arm ball joints, but I was able to get it to work without bending the bracket too much. The correct pinion seal had come into O'Reilly's, so I was able to hammer it in using a bit of wood and a small sledgehammer before reinstalling the pinion and pinion nut, hopefully at the correct preload. You'll notice a small jump here where I spent a whole day wire wheeling the axle, the knuckles, and the brake calipers before coating everything in chassis paint or caliper paint. The calipers and knuckles were allowed to dry for a few days before I started reinstallation. I made the same mistake on both knuckles and forgot to install the ABS sensor bracket on the upper ball joint before reinstalling the new castellated nut. Both sides I forgot this on and I had to take it back apart. When I finally got it fixed, I torqued the upper ball joint nut to 75 foot-pounds and the lower one to 80 foot-pounds. I then made sure to align the cotter pin hole and install the cotter pins. It was in the 90s when I was doing this, so the GoPro was overheating and I had to start swapping back and forth between my phone and the GoPro. Next up on the axle, I installed the driver's side CV axle shaft, being careful to try and keep the shaft centered during installation. I had read that you should leave the diff cover off for this, just in case you mess up the inner seal and have to disassemble the diff. I didn't run into any issues, and I'm honestly not sure if I would have noticed either way. But next I installed the wheel bearing and hub assembly and torqued it down. Those three bolts get torqued down to 75 foot-pounds. I definitely wanted to install the axle nuts at this point, but I realized that the new CV axle shafts only came with the nuts and not the washers. And unfortunately, I threw out the old washers along with the old CV axle shafts. So I had to call O'Reilly's and order axle nut kits, which came with the nuts and the washers. Next, I installed the small brake line brackets onto the axle, as well as the Iron Rock bar pin eliminator lower shock mounts. Then I lubed up the hub surface with some anti-seize before throwing on the new rotor and doing a soft install of the spacers. The brake calipers were next, and I was very pleased that this Jeep already came with the Akebono front calipers, which they're still floating calipers, but the metal on metal slide pins and the metal guide pads for the brake pads were perfect for preventing significant deflection and definitely better than the rubber bushing style calipers that come with the wire clip. I torqued the brake bracket bolts down to 75 foot-pounds and the slide pin bolts to 30 foot-pounds. I think it's important to note that I cleaned out the inside of the bracket slide pin holes with a wire brush on a drill to clean out any rust before lubing it all up and installing it. Once the driver's side was done, I moved on to the passenger side and finished that up, also installing the new StopTech brake lines using a 11mm socket on the banjo bolts and torquing it down to 23 foot-pounds. After installing the lower shock mount, I noticed that there seemed to be an issue with it bowing inward, and after double checking with the sleeve, there was definitely an issue. This is really dumb, but the spring bucket repair still caused an issue with the bolt hole alignment, so I ended up taking off the mounts, drilling them out a bit more, and using the shock mount bushing sleeve as a guide while tightening down the bolts to ensure that the bracket didn't bend inward while being torqued. Next, I moved on to loosely installing the upper and lower control arms. Just like in the rear, these would not be torqued until the vehicle was under its own weight at ride height. So, I installed these in 3 stages. The hand-tight assembly, then later on I would do the ratchet-tight preparation while installing on the Jeep, and finally the torquing when it was actually on the ground. I also installed the new to me diff breather that I got off a junkyard WJ since mine broke in half from dry rot. It was just really old. The diff breather has a small clip that goes onto the driver's side upper control arm. Next, I quickly installed the adjustable track bar, starting at the same length as the stock one. I tried really hard to install those axle nuts and torque them down, but I just couldn't get them tight enough since the axle would start spinning. So I decided that I would just have to wait until after the axle assembly was installed on the vehicle and the vehicle was on the ground. The axle was almost done though, and I would need to install the wheels and tires before moving on to installing the diff cover. I still had paint left over from the rear diff cover, so even though I think the red wrinkle paint is awful, I used it on the front. And I had it dry for, it was either 1.5 or 2 weeks. I used a lube locker gasket on the front also, and I followed the torquing directions on the lube locker packaging, torquing the bolts to 30 foot-pounds. I briefly considered filling the diff, but since there's still a seal that's holding in the fluid in the back, and I would be changing directions several times while I was trying to install it, I thought it best to wait until after the axle was actually installed to put the fluid in. I didn't think that it was a big deal to lift from the transmission bell housing, but I googled this while editing this video, and apparently this is a really bad idea. I didn't have any issues though, and it allowed me to get the vehicle high enough to roll the axle underneath the chassis. I let the jack down and rested the vehicle on jack stands located on the transmission crossmember. The issue with that location is that it's pretty far back. So I put the jack in a position underneath the radiator support, not as a lift point, because that area is super weak and you definitely don't want to lift from there, but just as a safety point, because I'd rather have the vehicle crush the radiator support than, crush me. I ended up having to move it anyway because I had to allow the upper and lower control arms to move properly into position. Unfortunately, I did have to remove the upper control arm bolts from the axle and install the upper control arm into the chassis first before installing the springs and realigning everything with the ratchet strap. This all took a lot of time and patience, but my order for success was axle lower, chassis lower, then chassis upper, springs, and then finally axle upper. At this point I wanted to celebrate that the axle was finally installed, but there was still more to do, including installing the shocks and adjusting the track bar for reinstallation again, because I had to pull it off. I had to adjust the track bar so many times, that, you know, if I had to do it again, I would just leave the entire thing off until everything else was installed, including the, you know, the rest of the steering and suspension. And then I would make my changes. Next, I installed the sway bar, filled the diff with AMSOIL 80W90 gear oil, installed the ABS sensors and brake lines before bleeding the system with my one-man bleeder. At some point while I had the axle out, I decided to pull off the front drive shaft using a 10mm socket so that I could replace the U-joint on the axle side. But when I started manipulating it, I noticed that the Rzeppa joint on the transfer case side, which is essentially a CV joint, it was toast. The boot was ripped and it didn't look like there was any grease in there. There wasn't money for an upgrade to a double cardan, so I just ordered a new Rzeppa joint rebuild kit from 1A Auto. I had everything to repair the drive shaft by the next week, and I got to work by first removing the old U-joint, using needle nose vice grips to remove the retaining clips, and hammering out the old U-joint. When I got to the Rzeppa joint, I popped off the back cap and tried to remove the snap ring with standard tools, but I couldn't make it work. So I had to run out and buy snap ring pliers to get it off. At that point, it should have been just a couple quick blows from a hammer to pop the joint off, but it wasn't. I spent an hour drenched in sweat trying to get it off, and then I jumped in my truck and drove down to O'Reilly's to try 3 different pullers and 1 press tool, but nothing could get it off. It was just completely seized on there. I ran to the junkyard and spent an hour going under each WJ, and I checked out a few other Jeeps to see if, something there would match, but nothing did. I had watched some rear axle bearing replacements where people used an angle grinder to cut through the bearing and then they snapped it off with a chisel. So I decided to do the same thing with the joint. If it worked, then awesome. If it didn't, then I'd end up having to buy a new drive shaft on Rock Auto for around $250 shipped. It took almost 2 hours, but I got the joint off and went straight into installing the rebuild kit. The kit came with everything necessary, including the grease for the bearings. After it was all put together, I moved on to the U-joint. I bought a serviceable joint from O'Reilly's just because, that's what they had in stock. And I'm an idiot, so I pointed the grease joint forward toward the axle, which means that I will not be able to grease it without pulling off the straps, undoing the connection, and then greasing it. But I definitely wasn't going to take it apart to fix it. Afterward, I threw on a quick coat of paint, and she was glorious. Quick note, don't take glamour shots like this and then set your phone down right next to the drive shaft because it will fall and break your phone screen. Alright, so now I could finally install the drive shaft, but it was really annoying because the rebuild kit bolts were socket cap instead of hex head. And I would have used the old bolts if, I didn't throw them away and the trash pickup wasn't a few days before this. But I did eventually get to torque these bolts to 24 foot-pounds and the front pinion strap bolts to 14 foot-pounds. Next, I torqued the axle nuts to 175 foot-pounds, installed the castellated nut caps and cotter pins before trying to properly install the spacers. I don't know if there's a better way to do this, but I could not get the transfer case to lock the wheels and allow me to torque the spacer lug nuts. So I had to put a pry bar in the pinion and rested it on the ground to torque everything. 90 foot-pounds with red Loctite on the spacers, and 100 foot-pounds on the lug nuts for the wheels. The kit that I bought from 1A Auto came with new tie rods and drag link bar, but it did not come with a new lower tie rod bar. This meant that I had to just copy the original drag link and tighten it down, and then simply swap out the lower tie rods. I'm not sure whether the seized Rzeppa joint on the drive shaft or the tie rod replacement wins for the most difficult thing I've done on this Jeep, but it's close. This was exhausting. With plenty of WD-40 and a couple of vice grips and a jack bar, I was able to get out the old tie rods and install the new ones before moving on to the steering damper, which I had forgotten to purchase initially, and I had to order on Amazon for quick delivery. I had looked at a few different options, but I just ended up going with the Rough Country since it's a larger damper than stock and it was an easy buy on Amazon. The directions aren't very clear, and it left me with a nylock nut on a bolt that wasn't long enough to reach the nylon. Maybe it would have worked better if I bought it directly from Rough Country, but this kit was kind of more of a universal kit. I'm not really sure how they sell it directly from the manufacturer, so I wasn't satisfied with the fitment on this. I had the vehicle on the ground at this point, so I could start torquing down all of the suspension. I didn't record myself making adjustments to center the axle because it took a really long time just to figure out how to measure it and how to adjust it. I eventually ended up marking center positions on the upper spring mount and measured from the center tread of the tire to that point on both sides. The first time it was about 3/4 of an inch off, and I had to adjust the track bar on the axle side by pulling the bolt out of the bushing, rotating the end to the appropriate length, and then using a ratchet strap to move the axle into a position where I could put the bolt back in. I did all that before installing the tie rods, which was a mistake. And then I had to do it again with the tie rods after eyeballing the toe, and then I had to do it again after the suspension settled. All the while ensuring that the steering wheel was centered appropriately. I'm not sure if there's a proper procedure for all this, but I just kind of wildly adjusted stuff back and forth and generally wasted my time. Once I got it right, I torqued the damper to axle bolt to 65 foot-pounds. All of the tie rods were 35 foot-pounds, and I installed the cotter pins, and then I torqued down the clamps. All of the clamps got torqued down to 35 foot-pounds. Both upper control arm bolts got torqued to 45 foot-pounds, while the lower control arm was at the axle was 120 foot-pounds, and at the chassis was 115 foot-pounds. I definitely tried tightening the upper shock mounts to the torque spec, but they were crushing way too much, and after rereading the Iron Rock install instructions, I had to back them off to a point where the disc was compressed just to the washer width. You don't actually have to torque them. The last part to add to the front was the front suspension skid plate. I'm sure that this provides some protection, but it does look a little funny because the lift makes the steering component sit lower than the skid plate, which kind of makes the skid plate pointless. I drove the vehicle for about 30 miles before getting in alignment, and I recentered the axle in that time to make sure that I wasn't throwing away money at the alignment shop. The lift definitely affected the pinion angle and everything else down the line, which might impact handling, but it wasn't terrible. I did, however, keep having steering issues, so I tightened up the steering box several times over a couple of weeks and tried to dial it in. This made a huge impact for the better, but it still wasn't great, so a week before I had to deliver the Jeep, I quickly ordered the IRO add-on damper to try and help. The second damper is installed on the drag link and the track bar using new clamps. You're supposed to completely disassemble the front suspension to do this, but I wasn't going to do that. So I just bent them open enough to be hammered on, and then I bent them back. Hopefully that didn't cause too much stress on the steel. I set the damper with enough length to enable travel in both directions, basically just based on the primary damper. I copied that length. And then I torqued everything down and went for a test drive. The damper helped with the bump steer on the road, but it made no difference at all in handling. So I was still working really hard just to keep the vehicle straight whenever I was traveling at high speeds. I've since delivered the vehicle to my mother, and she's still reporting, some of these same steering issues. At this point, I've tightened the steering box an entire turn, like a whole 360 degrees. And I really don't want to blow up the steering box and have to buy a new one by making more adjustments. So everything in the front has already been replaced. So next time I'm down in Florida, I'm going to go ahead and check out the steering shaft U-joints for any play. That might be where I'm having issues. It's kind of the only thing I can think at this point. Alright, so expenses for this episode were actually pretty high. The suspension category covers the new control arms, bushings, ball joints, tie rods, and wheel bearings, since most of that came in a set, but it also includes the adjustable track bar and the spring buckets. The steering category includes the steering dampers, the drive shaft repair, axle shafts and alignment. The differential service is simply the seal, gasket, and oil. But all of that brought the episode total to $1,372 and the project total to $8,681. I had 28 hours of video for this episode, but I estimated an additional 4 hours of labor for prep, paint, and axle/steering alignment, which is honestly really conservative. But that brings the project hour total to 83 hours so far. My first takeaway from this episode is a play on anyone can cook. Any idiot like me can go out and buy a welder and then just weld. But what's missing, and what I'm missing specifically, is the training. What does a good weld look like? What does it sound like? Do I need to adjust voltage or wire speed? Is it the wrong wire diameter? Is there enough penetration? I don't have the training or experience to know the answer to those questions. This episode was hard for me because of that. It's not only embarrassing as an individual to show that I suck at welding, but it's frustrating personally to know that I can't do something well. But I am determined to do better and keep practicing. I'll note that as soon as I switched to MIG, my welds were immediately better, which is ironic because flux core is just easier to get started on. But I've found personally that it's harder for me to weld with. I thought that I needed to learn to weld flux core before MIG and then MIG before TIG, but I should have just gone out and bought a bottle of gas right away. My second takeaway is that if you get a cut in your CV boot, then they need to be replaced immediately or they could cause serious problems. I'm glad that I was able to fix that old Rzeppa joint to get it off of there on the drive shaft and replace it. Third takeaway is that I should have had a logical plan for centering the axle and doing the at-home alignment before taking it into the shop to get a real alignment. Not having a good plan wasted hours of my time. My last takeaway is that I should have just bought a 3.5-inch lift kit from one of those main companies that sell them. It would have been physically higher off the ground than I wanted it to be, and I'd have to do a retrofit on the front drive shaft, but it would have saved me the cost of the control arms in the set that I bought, and more importantly, the control arms would be adjustable so I could correct the pinion angle in both the front and the rear. I know this is a departure from my thoughts during the rear axle episode, but thinking about it now, it probably would have been the better choice. So that is it for this episode. The next episode I'll be covering maintenance on the transmission and transfer case, which turned into a nightmare where I thought I was going to have to buy a whole new transmission. But we'll see that in the next one. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I will see you the next time I manage to get an episode out.